Vintage Audio Attic, Repair and Restoration. This video will show the repair and restoration of a Rotel RA610 integrated amplifier that was built in 1972, and it's in need of some service. Normally what I do, and in this case I did, I remove the top and bottom covers just to take a look at the equipment before I went forward. This RA610 seems to be built very well. I've removed the faceplate so that I can clean it easier. Any vintage stereo repair or restoration involves plenty of cleaning. With the faceplate removed, it's also easier to clean the pots and the switches with deoxit. During the initial testing of this Rotel RA610 integrated amplifier, I was unable to adjust the idle current on the left channel. After some troubleshooting, I found a defective diode. This amplifier being 45 years old, well, almost 50 really, this is not a surprise. Most of them do have issues. Many times the old components are not available, and in this case this particular diode wasn't, so I used two modern diodes to make the replacement that I needed. You just put two diodes in series, and it's a pretty easy fix, and the diodes are only a couple cents a piece, so for just pennies you can you get this fixed up. You'll normally need to remove some of the assemblies to get the deoxit into the controls without making a huge mess of everything. I'll also be recapping this RA610, so you need to get the assemblies where you can get at them. The 50-year-old capacitors have far exceeded the time that they were designed for. The old ones and the new ones, there's quite a bit of difference in the physical size of them. One of the assemblies I've recapped, and it's ready to be reinstalled. I'll work on the phono section next. Most of the boards were not the easiest to get to. Overall, it wasn't terrible, but it was a little bit more difficult than some of them. Capacitor replacement's a must in any unit this old. You've just got to get them out of there. They've been in there just for many years longer than they were designed to be there. The tone controls were soldered with wire between the slider switch and the tone assembly, and this needed to be removed. Once I removed several soldered connections, I was able to get the assembly loose, and then with it loose, I was able to get it into a position to where I could replace the capacitors. I've got the capacitors replaced, and now I'm going to remount the assembly to the chassis. I had to clean up the old solder off the slider switches, so that I could solder the new wire onto the switches properly. And speaking of that, I did have to use some new wiring, as the old wires were just too brittle to keep. Like any wire, you bend them back and forth a few times, and you just need to replace them. I've reinstalled the tone assembly, and now hopefully this assembly won't need to be out of here for another 45 or 50 years. No guarantee of that, but hopefully. Alright, I'm done replacing the capacitors and diodes at the top of the chassis, and now it's always good to get it back together a little bit. You've worked on several assemblies, and just test out your work as you go along to make sure everything's still working okay. I'm going to install under the chassis power supply filter capacitors. In this unit, there's enough room underneath the chassis. It's pretty spacious under there, and these capacitors are not huge in size, especially the modern ones, so they'll fit under there pretty easily. Always take plenty of pictures and notes. You know, write it on paper, whatever works for you, before you remove any wires. So in case there's any questions, once you get everything unhooked, you can get it back hooked up properly. There's no speaker protection in this RA610. That wasn't unusual back in 1972. So just make sure you check your work carefully before powering the unit up. And after you get done with the filter capacitors, it's always a good idea to let it run a little while, and then you can do some bias and DC offset checks and adjustments before hooking up the speakers. I'm going to also reset the power transistors. I mean, I've got it here. There's only 4 of them. They're quite easy to reach, so why not do that? A new transistor insulator and some new thermal compound. You know, it's only pennies worth of parts to do that, so why not do that? I'll use warm water and just soap along with a little scrubbing to clean up the knobs and the switch covers. I'll also clean up the RCA jacks and the speaker connections as well with deoxit. I think we're about ready here to wrap it up. I'll let it run on the test bench a little bit, and we'll call it complete. So this Rotel RA610 integrated amplifier repair and restoration is complete. It's time for some music. Alright, I've got my Rotel RA610 integrated amplifier in the system. It's rated at 32 watts a channel. On the test bench it does more like 40. Like a lot of the old vintage stereo equipment, they were fairly conservative in their specifications, and it's rare that any piece can't meet the specs, and this one's certainly no exception to that. It was built in 1972, so it's getting close to 50 years old. I've had it about 10 years. I rebuilt it several years ago. It's got all new electrolytic capacitors all the way through it. Of course, all the controls were cleaned up, and it's really been a nice little amp. It's never a disappointment when I stick it into the system. You know, just goes to show you, you don't have to have just all the top-end vintage equipment to get good sound. And this isn't the only unit from, you know, back in the late 60s, early 70s that when operating properly, I think that's the whole key, operating properly, they can certainly hold their own with any of the vintage equipment as well as a lot of the new equipment. I wouldn't be embarrassed to put this little guy in any system. I mean, it's really got a nice tonal balance. It's really got some kick for being a little amp too. So if you've got efficient speakers, you can really you know, play some loud rock and roll with it, and it'll handle it easily. It's got, you know, a lot of features, really for a small amp. It's got 2 speaker systems. It has the mode control like a lot of them do. You know, I don't know what good this will do most people, but it has it. You know, most people 99.989% of the time are going to leave it in stereo, but it's got it. It's got a balance control, of course, a volume control. Down below here, again, a muting button, low and high filter. It does have a tone defeat button, which is nice. So if you're not using the tone controls, which I'm not, you know, you take that circuitry out. It's got a tape monitor and a loudness button. You know, it's got sliders for the bass and treble. You know, pretty nice looking little unit, and the input selector's really got a nice selection here. You've got 2 phono, which is nice. You got a tuner, which was standard, you know, of course, back in the early 70s, and 2 auxiliaries, which again is very nice. So it's a pretty well equipped little amp, and really sounds good. If you ever find one out there, I don't think you'd be disappointed in it, as long as you refurb it. As I said, it's about 50 years old. And then one thing to keep in mind with this amplifier, and this isn't that unusual either for 1972, this amplifier has no speaker protection built into it. There is no protection circuitry. There are no speaker relays. So before I hook this guy up, I always check the DC offset. Because, I could have 30 volts on the speaker outputs and I wouldn't know it. My speakers would end up knowing it. But, you don't have that little bit of extra protection. So she's just hanging out there. She's got a couple line fuses in her. But it's just a good idea before you use this amplifier that you check the DC offset, because there's nothing, there's no protection circuitry within it that is gonna help you protect your speakers. So just thought I'd throw that in. All right, well, no disappointments there. This little Rotel integrated amp from 1972. It specs out at 32 watts a channel. It does more, right around 40 watts a channel. With a pair of efficient speakers, she'll get loud. And very clean and clear. Just always a pleasant surprise. Puts a smile on my face. Visit VintageAudioAddict.com for more repair and restoration tips on your vintage audio equipment.